Well, thank you, moderator. I'm Epistia Pujawati as the second speaker for today. I'm going to talk about sampling in quantitative research. As we know that quantitative research is the process of collecting and analyzing numerical data. Well, before we come to the sampling, I'm going to talk about what point that I'm going to talk for today. The first one is sample, the second one is sampling, the third one is sampling advantages, and the last one is types of sampling techniques. Now we come to the first explanation. Sample. What do you know about sample, guys? Sample is a smaller but hopefully representative collection of units from a population used to determine truth about that population. Sampling, on the other hand, is the process of selecting a number of individuals for a study in such a way that the individuals represent the larger group from which they were selected. Now, what are the sampling advantages? Here, I state 5 points. The first point is reduced cost and time. Since using a sample reduces the number of people that have to be reached out, it reduces cost and time. Imagine the time saved between researching with a population of millions versus conducting a research study using a sample. So, sampling reduces cost and time. The second point is reduce resource deployment. It is obvious that if the number of people involved in a research study is much lower due to the sample, the resources required are much less. The workforce needed to research the sample is much less than the workforce needed to study the whole population. And the third point is accuracy of the data. Since the sample is indicative of the population, the data collected is accurate. Also, since the respondent is willing to participate, the survey dropout rate is much lower, which increases the validity and accuracy of the data. And the fourth point is intensive and exhaustive data. What does it mean? Since there are lesser respondents, the data collected from a sample is intense and thorough. More time and effort is given to each respondent rather than having to collect data from a lot of people. And the last point here is apply properties to a larger population. Why? Because since the sample is indicative of the broader population, it is safe to say that the data collected and analyzed from the sample can be applied to the larger population, and it will hold true. And now we come to the types of sampling techniques. There are two types of sampling techniques. The first one is probability sampling techniques, and the second one is non-probability sampling techniques. And probability sampling techniques is the best method to achieve a representative sample. Now we come to the probability sampling technique. Probability sampling, each member of population has an equal probability of being selected. Its designs are used when the representativeness of the sample is of importance in the interest of wider generalizability. On the other hand, non-probability sampling, probability of any particular element of the population being chosen is unknown, and the selection of units in non-probability sampling is quite arbitrary, as researchers rely heavily on personal judgment. Now, probability sampling technique, there are three things that we are going to talk in this topic. The first one is random sampling, second one is cluster sampling, and the third one is stratified sampling. And for non-probability sampling techniques that we are going to talk here is there are convenience sampling, judgmental sampling, quota sampling, and snowball sampling. Let's come to the first one, random sampling. For random sampling, a simple random sample is one in which each and every member of the population has an equal and independent chance of being selected. So for the situation, I make the example like this. The total students of 560, you take the sample 20 and you take randomly, or you can also use lottery method for this random sampling, guys. The advantages for using this technique is easy to conduct, high probability of achieving a representative sample, easy to analyze and interpret results, and easy to understand. On the other hand, there are some disadvantages from this technique. Identification of all members of the population can be difficult. Contacting all members of the sample can be difficult. And the second one is cluster sampling. The process of randomly selecting intake group, not individuals within the defined population sharing similar characteristics. Cluster sampling is defined as a sampling technique in which the population is divided into already existing grouping, or we call it clusters. And then a sample of the cluster is selected randomly from the population. The term cluster refers to a natural but heterogeneous intake grouping of the members of the population. The most common variables used in the clustering population are the geographical area. Heterogeneity of the cluster is an important feature of an ideal cluster sample design. So this is the explanation from cluster sampling. Now we come to the example of cluster sampling. For example, the population is all elementary students in the local school district. And the groups or the cluster is 11 different elementary schools in the local school district. Obtain a simple random sample, 4 elementary schools from the first possible elementary school. And you can take the sample, every student in the 4 selected elementary school. In this technique, there are advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are very useful when populations are large and spread over a large geographic region. Convenient and expedient. Don't need the names of everyone in the population. But on the other hand, the disadvantages are representation is likely to become an issue. Requires that each population elements be assigned only one cluster. Now, the third stratified sampling. Stratify means to classify or to separate people into groups according to some characteristic, such as position, income, education, gender, or ethnic background. These separate groupings are referred to as subsets or subgroups. For a stratified sample, the population is divided into groups or strata. A random sample is selected from each stratum based upon the percentage that each group represents in the population. Well, there are two kinds of this kind of techniques. The first one is proportionate stratified sampling. The sample size of each stratum in this technique is proportionate to the population size of the stratum when viewed against the entire population. This means that each stratum has the same sampling fraction. And disproportionate stratified sampling. In a disproportionate stratified sampling, sample size for each stratum is not allocated in proportion to the population size, but is dictated by analytical considerations. Now, the example here, the population is all elementary students in the local school district. And the group or strata is 11 different elementary schools in the local school district. Simple random sample, 20 students from each of the 11 elementary schools. And the sample is 11 times 20 equal to 220 selected students. The advantages is more accurate sample can be used for both proportional and non-proportional samples. Representation of subgroups in the sample. Reduce sampling error. Permits separate control over design and selection of the sample within each stratum. More representativeness of the population characteristics. Reduce travel and other costs of data collection. On the other hand, the disadvantages are identification of all members of the population can be difficult, and identifying members of all subgroups can be difficult. It also may be costly and difficult to prepare the list of population elements in each subgroup. Now, we come to non-probability sampling. In non-probability sampling, we are going to talk about convenience sampling, judgmental or purposive sampling, snowball sampling, and quota sampling. Convenience sampling, in this sampling, guys, is commonly known as unsystematic, accidental, or opportunistic sampling. According to this procedure, a sample is selected according to the convenience of the investigator. In this method of sampling, the choice of sample items depends primarily on the judgment of the researcher. In other words, the researcher determines and includes those items in the sample which he thinks are most typical of the universe with regard to the characteristic of research project. A type of non-probability sampling which involves the sample being drawn from that part of the population which is close to hand, that is, readily available and convenient. For example, suppose 100 car owners are to be selected, then we may collect from the RTO's office the list of car owners and then make a selection of 100 from that to form the sample. The second one is judgmental or purposive sampling. In this method, the sample selection is purely based on the judgment of the investigator or the researcher. This is because the researcher may lack information regarding the population from which he has to collect the sample. Population characteristics or qualities may not be known, but sample has to be selected. In judgmental or purposive sampling, the choice of sample items depends primarily on the judgment of the researcher. In other words, the researcher determines and includes those items in the sample which he thinks are most typical or the universe with regard to the characteristic of research project. Okay. Next, quota sampling. In this method, the sample size is determined first and then quota is fixed for various categories of population, which is followed while selecting the sample. In quota sampling, determined in advance and intimated to the investigator. The quota for each segment of the population may be fixed at random or with a specific basis. Normally, such a sampling method doesn't ensure representativeness of the population. Example, suppose we want to select 100 students, then we might say that the sample should be according to the quota given below. Boys, 50%, girls 50%, then among the boys 20% college students, 40% plus 2 students, 30% high school students, and 10% elementary school student. A difference of the same quota may be fixed for the girl. And the last one is snowball sampling. Snowball sampling refers to identify someone who meets the criteria for inclusion in the study. Selection of additional respondents is based on referrals from the initial respondent. Well, that's all from me, from the second speaker. Next, the explanation related to the sampling in qualitative data will be explained by the third speaker. Thank you.